Rights and Governance Program Officer working at the Ford Foundation. And I think you'll all agree with me that the last 2 days have been an intense 2 days, and we've heard a lot. And I think this is probably a very difficult panel in terms of thinking about the closing and where we go from here. And I think we've all heard the duplicity of meanings of Marikana at different levels. And I think this panel is going to really look at what the implications are moving forward at a range of levels. We heard this morning the pointed question about why haven't we heard enough about the political meanings? We've heard about the economic ramifications. We've heard about implications at community level, at state level, at labor levels. And this panel is really, I'm going to try to get us to really give our presentations and then have some really open discussion about how we move forward from here and what all of this means as we go forward. So think of it as the forward-looking panel. And I think we'll be quite strict in terms of time so that the people in the audience have a chance to really interact and engage, because this is the closing panel. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peter Alexander, who needs no introduction really. I'm sure you've all seen his book, A View from the Mountain, Marikana, out front. And he's going to be kicking off this closing panel.
Well, first, thank you very, very much indeed, Nikki, because you've been an inspirational figure at the Ford Foundation, ensuring that a lot of very good work has been done around Marikana, supporting lawyers making films and also supporting our research. I want to congratulate SWOP, not just for this conference, which has been very well organised in my view, and I think it's likely to be seen as the conference on Marikana. The quality of the presentations has been fantastic and the discussion has been very good. But I also want to congratulate SWOP because this concept came out of nowhere. It comes out of decades of very solid, very impressive research undertaken by the unit, firstly under Eddie and then more recently under Karl. My own involvement in Marikana really started on the 18th, 2 days after the massacre. I went up to Marikana to the big meeting there. On the Sunday, I was very disappointed that the Sunday newspapers hadn't covered what it was like to be a worker on the mountain. What was it like to be shot at and to have all these stun grenades and so on being fired at you. So on the Monday I went to Marikana with two very good research assistants, field workers, Tabelo Lakoa and Botsan Morpi. And our concern was just to try to get the workers' perspective. And what emerged from that was people telling us about this second site of killings. We called it the killing copy. And I suppose in some senses we were the ones who discovered it in terms of the way in which it was represented in the media. And I can tell you it was a very chilling experience, suddenly realising that what we were looking at was a place where 13, 14 people had been killed by the police, shot dead. We saw the evidence of the blood. We saw people's clothes that had been soaked in blood. And then, of course, we saw these yellow letters that the police had left behind so that we could count up the number of people that had been killed. Now, the thinking behind that piece of research and the book which emerged afterwards was that it was important to capture the voices of workers, to get the perspective of workers. That if you're going to have an holistic understanding of something that's happened, you can't cut out the main actors, which is what the police were doing. In the media, only 4% of the information around Marikana in the week of the massacre was coming from workers. And what's impressive about this conference for me is that the people who are presenting the papers are in one way or another rooted in the experience of workers in Marikana, in Rustenburg, in Zimbabwe, and in various other countries around the world. And that's what's given it its character, that's what's made it exciting, and that's what's given it new perspectives that we haven't come across in the media. That's something which needs to be praised and built on in the future. It's something which is important for students in particular to take note of, because it's not just that we have academic conferences to share ideas with each other. They're also about developing new ideas that can challenge the hegemonic views in society. And those at the moment are shaped by people from newspapers, they're shaped by people from business studies, and I think what's emerging in this conference is the development of a new perspective about Marikana and the platinum industry. It's important to do this, partly because of the enormous social gulf which has emerged in South African society. It's been there before, but it's become much more political in the recent years and since Marikana. People complain about the gulf within the trade unions between the leaders and the members. That's clearly there. There's also a gulf between lawyers and people, seen at Marikana. There's a gulf between some academics and ordinary people. It's there, and we have to try to bridge it. And one of the strengths of this conference is the number of workers that Gavin and others have managed to get along. And I must say that one of the strengths of Gavin's own work is he's not just a political economist, he's also a political economist who does sociological field work, so he's able to link together the concerns of workers with an understanding of the way in which the society in general operates. Now let me just give one example of why I think this is important. In recent weeks there's been much discussion about the problems facing the gold mines, and they always experience gold problems when there's a wage dispute. And the same thing will be coming up in platinum in the very near future. And one of the things you don't get, of course, from the business press is a proper understanding of the way in which the value of the rand in particular affects the possibilities for mining companies to improve wages. Let me just fill this in a little bit. The price, and I want to do it in relation to platinum, but gold is not very different. The price of platinum now is $1,500 per ounce, very close, probably a touch higher than it was this time last year. At the same time, as far as I know from watching statements from Lonmin, the production level in platinum generally is about as planned, slightly higher than expected for last year prior to the strike. Given that the platinum is sold in dollars, and that the dollar has risen about 20% against the rand, in rand terms, this means that the income of these companies will rise by something like 20% this year. In other words, they have no difficulty whatsoever in absorbing a 10% rise in wages. I think the gold workers could have got more than they did, and I hope that in platinum people would push for higher wages as well. The companies operate on the basis of fear. Fear that they're going to close down, fear of mechanisation. And we've seen this in gold, and we've seen it in other industries as well. Very interesting in the Western Cape, when the strike was on there, all of the farmers were saying, we can't possibly afford to pay these workers extra money. We'll go out of business, they'll lose their jobs. What's the situation now, several months later? As far as I know, nobody's lost their jobs, their pay has been increased, and it may be that the margins of some of those farmers and owners has been squeezed slightly, but that really hasn't been a serious problem. So that's one example of what I mean by challenging the dominant ideas, and it's something which is going to be an ongoing process. I wanted to slip in this slide very quickly, but I'm going to move on. It's really an aside, because I wanted to mention something that perhaps could have been covered, needs to be covered in the future, and this is to think about platinum in relation to the other minerals being produced in South Africa. And the point of this slide is to show that in terms of total sales in 2011, the value of coal was in fact slightly higher than platinum. So we need to hang on to that both in terms of comparison and also in terms of connectivity. Because of course the biggest company in coal is still Anglo-American. Anglo-American is also dominant in iron ore, and we know it's the largest company in platinum. So it's still a very important company. Now, since Marikana, I've been also asked to kind of speak at various kinds of industrial relations events. You know, there's a bit of a crisis when I get invited to speak about industrial relations. And one of the things that seems to me to be a case on the basis of those discussions is that there's not really an industrial relations solution or a labour relations solution to the crisis that many people feel now exists post-Marikana. This is not like 1922 after the Rand Revolt, when you can introduce new labour relations legislation, the Industrial Conciliation Act, which is really the bedrock of all of the industrial relations legislation we've seen since. It's not like the situation after 1973-76, where you could modify that legislation by including black workers. What we're confronting now is a social problem, a socio-economic problem that exists in society. There's no simple solutions through changing industrial relations legislation. And this particular pie chart is aimed at summarising, encapsulating, in I think the easiest way, what the problem is that we face in South Africa. You'll see here that if we put together the formal and informal employment in South Africa, it comes to 41% of the population. This is lower than any other country that I can think of, lower than India, lower than China, lower than Brazil, etc., etc. We only have 2 in 5 of the working age population employed in any way whatsoever. Only about 27% of those in informal employment. If we put together the unemployed, both the discouraged work seekers and the formerly unemployed, it comes there, as you can see, to about 20.9%. What many people don't deal with in terms of understanding the working age population is the enormous part of the population that's not in the labour force whatsoever. And you can see here it's represented at 38.1%. So in South Africa, we only have a minority of the population, the working age population, engaged in work, producing things, adding to the development of the economy. And this really underpins the problems that we're facing. And the way in which that works itself out at the moment is in particular, not only, but in particular in terms of community protests. And this graph is one that we've put together through the data that we've been collecting in my research unit, based on media reports, some of them published, some of them unpublished. And what you can see here is that in 2011 we counted 465 community protests. 50% more than any previous year. The highest before was in 2009. Very rapid increase in community protests last year in the year of Marikana. And what we're finding is that an increasing number of those protests are violent, and that's reflected in the latest police data, which shows that for 2012-13, the number of peaceful gatherings was actually slightly down on the previous year, 2011-12. Sorry, I should put that a year back in both cases. But the number of unrest crowd incidents that were measured by the police had gone up from 1,226 to 1,882. A 50% increase in the number of unrest gatherings that the police had monitored. Alongside the industrial unrest that we've been concerned with and focused on in relation to platinum, there's this broader problem in society, which was the focus of a very, very interesting paper on Rustenburg. So that's the broader social malaise that we're dealing with and its impact. There are particular connections between the protests and platinum in the Northwest. And one of these is through the significance of informal settlements. The proportion of the population in South Africa living in informal dwellings increased nationally from 13.2% to 14.1% between. I think that's over the past 10 years. 10-year increase, 2002 to 2012. A bit of an increase. Now, when you look at it by province, in 6 of the provinces, there was a decline in the population living in informal dwellings. A slight increase in Gauteng and in the Western Cape, and most of the national increase in the proportion of the population living in informal dwellings is accounted for by one province, Northwest, where the numbers in informal dwellings goes up over that period from 12.3% of the population to 22.8% of the population. And that's very significant, because what we're finding in monitoring these protests is that most of them, or a very large proportion of them at least, are in informal settlements, where of course the services are particularly appalling, whatever services you're talking about, sanitation, housing, etc., etc. So there's a relationship then between numbers of people living in informal settlements and propensity to protest, and Northwest is right at the centre of that. Let me conclude then by picking up on a point that was raised yesterday, partly by Gavin and partly by Ben Fine, and that's the issue of nationalisation. But before doing that, let me just say something about the government, because I think one of the reasons why they are in a sense in denial is because they don't know what to do about the situation. It's not just that they are complicit in the way in which Gavin mentioned and the film showed last night. They don't know what to do. And this comes through most clearly in the only document that they've really produced that's followed up from Marikana, although Marikana isn't mentioned by name. And this is the Framework Agreement for Sustainable Mining Industry, entered into by organised labour, organised business and government. That's the title. This has been put together by Kalema Motlanthe, the Deputy President. It's a document that was billed in the media as a peace agreement, and there was concern that AMCU didn't sign it. I mean, when you look at it, you'll see if it's a peace agreement, it's really about peace between labour and capital. And I don't really see why AMCU had to sign it, because they weren't, as far as they were concerned at least, they weren't concerned in stimulating violence in any case. But what I find very interesting about this document is that although there are all sorts of platitudes in it about, you know, how to bring about better life for people and so on, essentially it doesn't propose any real changes. And this comes through in a couple of the formulations, in particular. The first is that it says to succeed, this agreement requires that stakeholders accept the economic realities, that economic realities constrain our decisions. Business as usual. And then later on, under Labour, it says that Labour must accelerate implementation of processes to transform the migrant, all of them must transform the migrant labour system, something we touched on this morning. And then there's a specific commitment from Labour, which is to work with government and business to improve investor sentiment. In other words, there's nothing radical in this that would really transform the situation post-Marikana. But what I want to suggest is there is something radical that can be done, and that's to address this question of nationalisation. And I want to deal with it by looking at some figures from Lonmin. This is from their 2011 annual report. Let me read it through to you just in case you can't see it at the back. In the left-hand column we've got the particular areas of expenditure, suppliers, social capital, which means community projects and donations, government taxes, human capital, which means salaries and benefits, directors' remuneration, shareholders' distribution, and cash retained for sustainable growth. Now, there are a number of points that one could make about this, including the fact that 2 executive directors and 8 part-time directors get paid almost as much as goes to community projects, or we could compare the amount that goes to directors with the amount that goes to workers in salary. But the point that I want to make here is to compare what might be regarded as class neutral, which works out about 32.7% of expenditure, with what goes to human capital, in other words, salaries and so on, which is 35.7% of expenditure, to what goes to capital, directors' remuneration, shareholders' distribution. But the really big one that people don't talk about is this thing here that's called cash retained for sustainable growth. It sounds nice, doesn't it? Sustainable. Cash. Stuff you put in your back pocket. This is $667 million that's being retained. Now this is money, some of it goes into building new shafts and so on, but a lot of it is just stashed away in some other country, almost certainly. We had some figures on that the other day. It's not being used in South Africa, where it's really needed to address those problems which I mentioned earlier. Now this isn't unusual. There are very interesting figures in the New Growth Path 2009, which shows that the workers' share of national income then was 45%, down from 50% in 1994. Meanwhile, profits, the share that goes to profits in national income was 45%, up from 40% in 1994. In other words, there's this shift in terms of the class character of South African society since 1994 in the interests of capital and profit. And I can't see any serious way of addressing that unless we start talking about nationalisation. Let me just make a few brief points, and then I'll close. That should be enough. Okay. The first is a long history of nationalisation in South Africa. Goes back to the beginning of the last century, through South African Railways and Harbours, developed through Eskom, and so on. And when we talk about nationalisation, I think we've got to move away from that colonial and apartheid notion, which was in part about developing the interests of the farmers, white farmers, white labour, and particularly later on Afrikaner capital, and start thinking about a form of nationalisation which is in the interests of the majority in society. In doing that, we can begin to think about nationalisation that tackles environmental problems which arise as a consequence of rivalry between capitals, a point that Dunbar made in his opening address when he spoke about the way in which the platinum companies don't talk to each other, don't cooperate, they fight with each other. And indeed, I would argue that it was rivalry between these companies, particularly over the employment of RDOs, that led to the strikes and eventually led to the catastrophe of the of the massacre. So nationalisation is a way of overcoming that. And in platinum, where we have two companies, Impala and Anglo-Plats, supplying 65% of world platinum, we can see that it's possible, if there were nationalisation of this industry, for South Africa to begin to set the rate at which platinum is being sold, and in doing so begin to look after the interests of the majority of the population. Now, the argument that I've heard against this from some people in AMCU, the AMCU leadership, is we don't want to do it, look at South African Airways, look at Eskom. And it's tempting to go along with that. I mean, some of the recent experience of nationalised industries in South Africa has been pretty appalling. Now, my response would be that you have to look then at the way in which this nationalisation is organised. Is it going to be done bureaucratically through a number of directors, in the case of Eskom, who are some of the most wealthy directors that there are in the country, or is it going to be done on the basis of ordinary working class people, workers, community members and so on, having a strong say in the decisions that are made within that nationalised industry? I also think that we need to think now about avoiding the way in which one pays companies, perhaps gold companies that are losing money, bailing out the owners, and then us as taxpayers having to pay for that over many, many years, the kind of thing that happened in Britain with the mining industry, for instance. And I think one way of avoiding this is by starting to think about not compensating people. And I really don't think this is a problem. Morally, I don't think it's a problem. When you look at, for instance, Anglo-Plat or any of these platinum companies, that in terms of their return on capital, have had wonderful return on capital year after year after year. They've already, in my view, got back much more than they invested, so why should we give them even more as taxpayers? Why shouldn't we get to a situation where if there's a problem with Eddie Webster's pension, because he's got 2 shares in Anglo-Plat, and he's beginning to starve, well, we begin to sort out that as a particular problem, rather than as a general problem that we need to build into a nationalisation model. So that's really the final point I want to make. I just want to echo, though, what Gavin said, partly in response to the question about politics. And that is that if we're going to talk about Marikana, we need to distinguish between Marikana as a strike, which is complicated, there's all sorts of social causes, and Marikana as a massacre, which is very simple to explain. The police killed 34 people. That's what it was about. That was a massacre. And the police did it, and they did it on the basis of instructions from the government.
Thanks, Peter. I think you've left us with lots of things to talk about during our discussion session, and you've come up with some proposed, what you call radical solutions. Karl, I'm now going to hand over to Karl, who needs no introduction, to talk us through some of his perspectives in terms of the way forward and the implications of Marikana.
Great, thanks, Nikki. Thanks. Yeah, no, it's great to be on this closing panel and to be trying to think through some of the implications of what we've been talking about today. I do, just before and your time keep me toughly. Just before starting, I wanted to say that one of the exciting things about this colloquium, this conference, is the range of research inputs that we've had, as well as the kind of range of people that we've got in the audience. And I'm talking here about people from communities, people from different unions, people from NGOs and human rights organizations. It's really a fantastic gathering of different constituencies and different organizations that are concerned about the impact of mining on our society. And I think that as director of SWOP, I do need to respond. I think particularly Comrade Eddie raised the question, well, what is SWOP going to do now? Others also raised the question, given the crisis of Marikana, what does it mean for academics and for SWOP? Most as many people have said, SWOP has worked for a long, long time with what was then the emerging trade union movement and with the NUM in particular. Now we've got a new union that's emerged out of this crisis, UNCU, and possibly other new unions as well. And for SWOP, I think what this means is that we have to work with organizations where there's rivalry in the field, but we are very keen to continue working with the NUM as well as to work with UNCU as a new union. And I think that on behalf of SWOP, I want to issue an invitation to both unions as well as to others, that if you want to just firstly engage with us about our research, have presentations on the research that we've done, as well as be part of shaping our research, because this is an ongoing, as many have said, this is just the beginning in some senses. We really want to welcome you and have those discussions and proceed in that way. So I just wanted to issue that assurance. I think our job is to try and analyze these events as clearly as we can and as deeply as we can and draw the conclusions that we do